A lot of times I'll ask somebody, have you ever been abused? And almost always the answer is no. Some would say, oh yeah, absolutely, I grew up in a very terrible situation. But a lot of people say, well, no, not really. And one of the reasons for that is because all that we know about life is what we've experienced. I'd like to say to you, all of us have a story. All of us have experiences. All of us grew up in an environment. Some people say, well, if you grew up in an environment I grew up in, you know, maybe all of us can say that to some degree. But really what's more important is it's not the environment that's so devastating to us. What's more devastating is my conclusion of my environment. It's what I concluded happened that's important, because that's how I perceive myself then at that point. So if I say to somebody, have you ever been abused? Some people go, no, I grew up in a good home. And maybe it's not consistent with the issues that they're dealing with, so I ask them, do you know what abuse is? And I think sometimes the answer is like, well, I ought to, I'm an adult, right? And when you go talking about it and explaining what abuse is, say rejection, incest, molestation, verbal, emotional abuse, physical abuse, you start talking about that and say, wow, I guess I've been abused, didn't even know it. Because that's our life experiences, and we think everyone may have our similar life experience. We're just unaware of that. If you're going to deal with conflicts with people, interpersonal relationship, be successful, you have to be aware of your own self. You have to be aware of your own pain. What we do with our pain will determine how successful we are as a person when it comes to dealing with other people. And I must say to you, and this is true for every one of us, me included, we have got to deal with our pain. We have got to deal with the issues that we have experienced that gets in the way of functioning adulthood. There's ways to do that. And one way that I want to suggest to you is this. I want to suggest to you what a theorist by the name of Erik Erikson has taught. I've tested this, I've talked it, and I find it to be true. Erikson breaks life into 8 stages of development. It's like infancy from like birth to 18 months, 18 months to 3 years, 3 years to 5 years, 5 years to 11 or 12 years, 11 or 12 years to 18 or 20, 18 or 20 to 40, 40 to 65, and from 65 old age. Each one of those stages of life, according to Erikson, has what he calls a psychosocial crisis. Sounds a little heady here, I don't mean it that way. Psycho is how we've learned to think, and social is how we interact. Each one of those stages carries a psychosocial crisis. The child has to learn. So the infant has to learn trust. How does an infant learn trust? By absorbing their environment. If they learn trust, it prepares them for the next stage. The next stage, he has to learn autonomy. We call it the terrible twos. We talk about potty training. We talk about learning how to be independent even though he's still dependent. It's a very interesting stage. I'm sure you parents understand that. And then we have from like 3 to 5 years old. That's when the child is learning to have the initiative to explore. And so he's touching everything, learning everything. You take your grandkids over to grandpa's house, you drive grandpa and grandma crazy because the child's in that stage. From that stage, from like 5 to 11 or 12, it's industry. The child's learning how to live and how to work. A child's play at that stage is his work. A child at that stage will play hard. They'll sweat, they're building forts, they're riding bikes, they're learning how to get along in school, they're learning all these interpersonal things in that stage of being industrious. It's a very, very interesting time. And then we go into our adolescence. That's when we learn identity. That's from like our 12 to 18 or 20. We're learning who we are. From 20 to 40, we're learning how to be intimate. We're learning how to love somebody other than ourselves. It's usually when we find our mates. And then from like 40 to 65, that's the stage I'm in. We're learning how to give back now. We're taking care of our own parents. Our children are grown now, and now we're giving back to society. We're volunteering, and it's called generativity. We're giving back now. And then old age, when you get 65 and older, if we've lived our life in a comfortable way, we've developed wisdom. We've developed a good part of life, or we become a cranky old man in despair or something like that. The issue is to understand ourselves. That's the stages of life. Erikson taught this, that somewhere in your developmental stages, if abuse or wounding or trauma has come into our lives, it interrupts emotional development. The 5 major abuses that affect the child's development would be these, categorically speaking. The first and most difficult would be rejection. You think about how easy it is to get rejected or feel rejected. It's very important that in the developmental stages of children that parents are in tuned enough to make sure that if an incident happens, that they work their child through it. And that's a good thing. And that's what parenting's all about. We have things in our lives that cause us pain. We just have to be aware of that. So one of the most difficult issues for a child to go through is a sense of rejection. The second most difficult would be incest. That would be inappropriate sexual influence from within the family system. It can happen very easily if you think about it. And then molestation, the inappropriate sexual influence from outside the family. Very, very easy thing to do nowadays, especially, so it seems. And then we have verbal, emotional abuse, then we have physical abuse. Most people, when you think about abuse, I'll ask the question, like, have you ever been abused? And a lot of times it's like, well, no, maybe my dad was a little harsh on me, which means like, maybe referred to physical abuse. So when we think of abuse, we have to think of physical abuse, maybe emotional abuse. We're becoming more educated, I think. But we don't always take into effect of how these 5 categories of abuse can hurt us. And we can be sitting here as educated people or adults or someone with a lot of life experience and not fully consider how that's happened. We've learned to accommodate that. We've learned how to protect ourselves, which opens the door for a lot of defense mechanisms. And so a lot of times we can be defensive and don't know it because that's our way of surviving. And so in counseling or talking with friends, or if you want to be an accountability partner or something like that, you go start poking around on areas that are sensitive, you get a reaction. And that's usually because something's there. It's important to recognize that we have these issues. And for us to take charge of that, which what we would say would be maturing. We become a mature adults because I'm taking charge of my life, I'm taking charge of my pain. I'm beginning to understand who I am. That is a great assignment, to talk through who you are, to recognize your pain. And if you can do that, you're on the way of being a healthy person. That's a great assignment.